Today, Future Medicine AI is joined by Dr. Keith Grimes, a GP of over 2 decades and founder of Curistica. His company supports clinical innovation for small and medium enterprises and helps them bring their ideas to fruition. So Keith, thank you very much for joining us today. You're a medical doctor by training, but you were actually initially interested in developing games, right?
Yeah, that's right. I am a gamer. I'm also a doctor. But I love technology. My earliest memories, when I think back to my earliest memory, it was watching Thunderbirds on TV. That's the first memory that I have, which was the Marionation one, but it was all about what they did and everything. And so I've loved technology all my life, sci-fi, the whole thing. And I was fortunate enough, so I was born in the 70s, so I was hit teenage when we started having things like Ataris, Spectrums, and Commodore 64s, and I just dived in. I was absolutely delighted. So I was playing board games and Dungeons and Dragons and that, and just thought, this is me, I want to do that for the rest of my days. And really wanted to go and write computer games, but I did quite well at school, and my parents, neither of whom were doctors or anything, said, no, what you need to do is you need to do law or medicine. And I did quite like medicine, the medical sciences, so I elected for that. And I went into that, and that's my medical career. But all the time thinking about technology and how I can get it into medicine, and then with what I saw in gaming was always about the cutting edge of the technology too. So I was quite lucky is that I was constantly seeing these new tech, thinking about how it came in. It just took quite a long time for everyone else to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because there are many parallels between gaming and sort of the cutting edge of technology. You look at graphics cards and GPUs and how they've now turned into powering large language models and things like that. I was wondering, how do you feel like your interest in that has sort of carved through your career? Your interest in your fundamental interest in gaming, how do you feel like that is sort of carved throughout your career?
Yeah, it's more, there's a kind of a couple of aspects. There's the technology aspect, and then there's a kind of creativity aspect as well. And what eventually with gaming became social, online gaming, which was hard at the start, but it's got way, way easier. So just from the technology point of view, I was always just using technology. And back in the 80s and 90s, if you wanted to play a game on a PC or whatever it was, you couldn't just fire a cartridge in the same way. You had to sort of, work with it a bit, and you had to configure everything. And so by necessity, you ended up having to learn an awful lot about the technology. And I ended up building PCs and stuff because I'm like building stuff. So you end up learning a great deal about the nuts and bolts of how this works. So you can play games, you should do that. And then when you had LAN parties, you had to learn about networking and everything. So by necessity, if you're playing the games, you have to kind of learn all about the tech. So you're doing this, and then you come back into the world of medicine, either at university or medical, or as a junior doctor or anything, and you think, this is crazy, even right now, the technology here, when I'm gaming, is great, and here it's totally backward. So you spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what can I bring back in? And you've also had a bit more kind of techie knowledge as well. So through medical school, I did an intercalated degree in deterministic chaos because that allowed me to work with signal processing in children. It was technically child health as well, but it was early 90s, and everyone was into that sort of stuff. So got into that. Then when I was a junior doctor, when I started out in the mid-90s, you had to fill out everything by hand, all the forms. It was a lot of paperwork. You'd have to run around the hospital. And so I built a database using Access to print out the forms, because it was still form-based, but I was always finding little things to do, wee hacks to do, to try and make my life easier. Then when I started as a GP in 2000, that was around about the time that the internet was kind of making it big. And I'd been using the internet since 93 sort of thing. And so I built my practice website, I started building little automation. So it was always I'm using tech somewhere else, I can use it here as well. So I was going from what I liked outside to what I brought inside. And the biggest example of that was my interest in virtual reality. So back in the 90s, there was VR, but it was really crummy. But the ideas then are the same as the ideas now. It's just the technology wasn't very good. So it kind of went quiet. And then in the early 2010s, you had things like Oculus Rift, which was, for those that don't know it, Oculus Rift was a virtual reality headset that dealt with some of the fundamental problems about responding very quickly. And that was used for gaming, of course, and I ended up getting it for that. But as I started learning about that, I started realizing that actually it's used in medicine in a research capacity. So I started using it with my patients, just using my gaming headsets and stuff with patients to distract them when they're having painful procedures. And it worked really, really well. So all the way along, I've seen how technology can be brought in and solve little problems and big problems, and been really keen to sort of share that. But the system, the healthcare system, definitely then was quite resistant. Now it's much better. It's still kind of slow. But yeah, that principle's gone all the way through, just seeing what's done elsewhere, thinking differently about how care can be provided.
So it sounds like you've had quite a natural curve of your interest in digital technology and innovation throughout your career. So would you say that there was a particular inflection point when you became particularly interested in AI, or if there was a particular moment when you made that switch to focus completely?
So I suppose with any of these things, it's one thing hearing about the promise of technology, and I love that as much as the next person, but when you see it working, and you see it working in a way that's maybe not obvious to everyone else, but you can see how it's going to get there, that's what usually gets me on board. So same with gaming, you know, the games of the 80s and 90s are kind of crummy compared to what they are now. But I still saw that, and you can envisage where it gets to. AI was very interested. Back in the early 90s, I was interested in something called cellular automata, which Stephen Wolfram's very into, you know, from Wolfram Research. And the essence of that, and it ties a lot to chaos theory, is that with very, very simple systems, really simple systems, you can end up with extremely complicated outputs. And the basis of that was very closely linked to neural networks. So I was interested in that. And then, of course, in gaming, there would be artificial intelligence, some simple rule-based stuff, and then they started adding some more different game landmarks. I've always been interested in that. But it was difficult. It's difficult to get that outside like an expert system into healthcare. So it was harder to get practical experience. I learned by doing. VR came along, and so I was really into that. I set up a group called VR Doctors. I spent a lot of time talking about it. I recorded a whole bunch of videos on YouTube about different ways you could use it. And I thought that was the way I was going to be going. But in the sort of late 2010s, and I was working as a doctor, very, very busy, and I was really quite unhappy because I wanted to get out to this thing. And I got quite ill. I got burnt out. And that was because I was trying to get out, but I was still doing all the work. And so I just, you know, burnt out. And as I recovered from that, I'd done enough talking about tech beforehand that a company called Babylon got in touch with me. And they said, oh, we see you doing all this sort of stuff. You obviously think about technology the same way that we want to think about technology. But at that point, it was a bit further on in my career, and they said, we've got some junior doctors that are helping building these products. Do you want to come in and be involved in the building of the products and help manage them? And that was when I came into Babylon, and that's when I got my first proper introduction to artificial intelligence. And yeah, from that point on, I saw it working, and I was like, here we go, and full in.
That must have been a really exciting time in your career, because you were the clinical innovation director.
Yeah. And that was, but that's one of those terms that could kind of mean anything. You know,
yes.
I was brought in for a few different things, in part because they had doctors coming in working with the AI scientists and researchers and the epidemiologists and the tech teams and the product teams. And they were building artificial intelligence. At first, an expert system, like a sort of rule-based system. And then they moved on to something called a probabilistic model, which is not something like generative AI, but somewhere along the way. And that was being used to help patients report their symptoms and give them information as to what that might be the cause, but also what they should do next. It's a very useful thing. And as we started doing that, they were using doctors that were quite junior in their career. And so one of the things that happens when you're a doctor is that over time you get more experience, more knowledge, and your ability to manage risk kind of improves. So you're more able to judge what risk needs to help and doesn't need help. But earlier on in the career, people tend to sort of be a bit risk averse, you know. So the model was quite risky, you know, it was like go to hospital kind of thing. And that's fine, but it doesn't help the hospitals. You don't want everyone sent there. Yeah. So I came in and helped work with them to understand more about the technology and start to try and find a way of weaving that knowledge in. And at the same time, doctors and healthcare professionals are used to working in a quite structured way. Yeah. And the world of health tech and startups is pretty unstructured. So to try and get them feeling more comfortable, learning and, you know, working better, I sort of came in for that, and that was the clinical innovation director. So I worked on a few things with that.
And I was going to say as well, this is something that I've gathered you're quite passionate about as well, is having doctors or people with extensive healthcare experience directly involved in these health startup initiatives, or these, you know, these biotech initiatives, rather than necessarily being run completely by people who are in tech and business, having that expertise on board as well.
Yeah, so clinical subject matter expertise, be that a doctor, a nurse, physiotherapist, people who've got clinical backgrounds. It always strikes me as quite surprising that we have an industry called health tech, right? But it's often people will start and build things without any health experience in it. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do this. I want to be very, very clear about that. But if I said, oh, I'm starting a health tech company, I'm not going to get anyone with any technical background. It's just going to be all of us doing it. People would say, well, that's crazy. You know, you need someone with technical expertise to do this. That's true. Just flip it around. Like, why on earth are you going to start building something without at least the involvement of someone from a healthcare background? Because a healthcare professional, whatever they are, clinician, is a professional in care. They understand the science of it, the history of it, the art of it, the reality of it. They know it from top to bottom. They've often spent a lot of time in that area as well. They're professionals in care. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be great when you put them in a health tech company, because a kind of raw clinician can be slightly disruptive sometimes. They're quite different worlds. You need to understand how to take that knowledge and translate it into that setting. So instead of being like the resource of knowledge and you just go, here you go, do this, don't do that, you come into kind of conversation. So that takes a bit of time, and you need to understand more about all the different parts that are involved and know when the information you give is important, when it's less important, and how to communicate it in a way that works. And that's more subtle, that evolves over time. It was that kind of thing that I was doing with the team, either learning it myself or doing it with the team at Babylon. And when you get these kind of hybrids, then you're really off to the races. It works very well.
That's really interesting. And could you touch on, for people who maybe aren't familiar, what happened with Babylon? And I guess what you learned from your experience there as well.
Yeah, so Babylon was a health tech company founded in 2013 by Ali Parsa, and it grew very, very fast. It was very well funded. He raised a lot of money. It was very successful in a number of different areas, and it was quite disruptive as well. It was looking at very, very different ways of providing care that was common at the time. And so if you look at the sort of lifespan, it was 2013 started, grew. I joined 2018, and at that point, it was heading towards unicorn status. It was valued at $1 billion or £1 billion. And it had started something called, the basic thing that it had was essentially see a doctor on your phone. Now that seems like, kind of so what, but at that point that was really unusual. They weren't the only people doing it, but they were definitely one of the biggest people doing it.
It was very frowned upon as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was the interesting thing, is that I'd been using Skype and everything for some of my patients back in the early 2010s as well, like little bits and pieces here. So I knew that it would be useful for some things and not others. But it was felt that this was a bad thing to do by most of the medical establishment. Like, how on earth can you treat a patient remotely? You have to see them face to face. You can maybe see them by phone, but that's about it. You're going to miss all these little nuances and everything like that. And so it was really frowned upon. And even when I was at Babylon, just the ability to be able to deliver care that way was felt to be a bad idea. And many doctors were not shy of saying this, and they would say it in no uncertain terms. And I have still got messages from doctors I work with who are pretty unhappy about it and threatening all sorts of things about referring me to the GMC, the regulatory body, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's fair to say that people didn't like the idea of it. But Babylon pushed ahead, and GP at Hand was an NHS service that people could sign up for, and you could see people face to face. But it also was digital first, which meant that your first point of contact was through the app. You could send a message, you could have a video consultation. And that works really well. It works particularly well for people that find traditional practice hard to access. So it does skew sometimes younger people of working age, people who are having to sort of commute and everything. That works fantastically well. But of course, the practices weren't seeing them and kind of thought of them as either the worried well or they had other things to deal with. And of course, there are more complex patients. But it was very successful. But the idea that a company could do this as well was pretty controversial. So you got that, plus the remote care, and then Ali's kind of unique style of not backing down and saying these things as well meant that Babylon was, came in for quite a lot of criticism. But the things that it did worked. We'll come on to the AI again in a minute because the AI came alongside that. But that being in place and the changes that happened kind of in the NHS to support that and the acceptance of the technology, in some ways was a very important thing when the pandemic hit. Because all of a sudden there was a lot of experience, not just from Babylon, there were other providers as well who knew about doing this. And then of course the pandemic hit.
Changed everything.
And yeah, like everyone just had to do this. And so it flipped over. And so there was a very high proportion of video consultations. Now that's dropped off because video consultations only have a certain value. Phone and like just messaging is really valuable. So now we're here after the pandemic. And people look back and say, oh, what Babylon did, it wasn't all that. Look, it's quite easy, we do it anyway. But they forget how controversial it was at the time. And it's really, really good to have it in place now. So for that reason, even though people were unhappy about what happened with Babylon, it did force some changes, and the NHS and healthcare is a different place in part due to what they did.
That leads on quite nicely to this kind of curve of technological development. So you've spoken about your early interest in technology through to virtual reality, and now we're in a completely new era. And my question is, do you think what generative AI, for example, is bringing now, do you feel like this is a significant inflection point, and how does it sort of differ from, basic digital technology that has sort of slowly been making its way into healthcare?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. That curve that you're describing is maybe the Gartner curve. The idea that with any new technology, there's definite phases. You start with this sort of rising expectation and, this sort of peak of expectations at the start. Where everyone gets very excited about it and things can get quite hypey and frothy and lots of money follows it. You get this sort of big peak. And then it kind of can't quite cash the checks that it's written, whatever it is. Often because of how people have talked about it and understood it. So it kind of drops off and then you get this sort of falling curve and then something called the trough of disillusionment where people are like, that technology was kind of nonsense, It falls off and that's a kind of boom and bust type thing. And then it kind of picks up again and you get this slope of enlightenment and this, what they then call this plateau of productivity. This is the point at which this technology has now made it to a point where it's useful. And Gartner are famous for putting this out there because actually a lot of technologies follow this. Like VR is the same, AI has been the same. What's interesting is this can happen multiple times as well. I talked about VR, like early 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s. We just had it just now, and it's
been the same with AI as well, because AI's had multiple decades ago. It's been, that it had the spike of interest and then the winter.
Yeah, exactly. And then now people are like, oh, is AI too frothy? Is it heading down this way? And will it or won't it? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, but the thing that happens is that none of these technologies happen on their own. Like quite often these new sparks of technology are fed by other things. So you talked about earlier on computer games and graphics cards, and then graphics cards with these incredibly powerful parallel processing, which is great for creating games and graphics. Actually, it's very, very good at running the kind of maths that's needed to do artificial intelligence and deep learning and large language models. So you have these technologies. You've also got the internet and the connectivity of that. You've got the rising speed of computing. All come together and then bang, you've got another, AI reaches another little peak and away you go again. What AI is doing though is that the latest technologies, such as large language models and generative AI, have got such kind of broad capabilities. Still slightly limited, there's still problems with them as well. That it's actually difficult to sort of conceive of all the areas it's going to be used. So that kind of makes the peak even higher. But there's kind of multiple peaks coming off it as well. And people say, well, it doesn't work in this area, but it's working in somewhere else. And AI moves at such pace that these curves are happening much faster and they're kind of overlapping. And you get this sort of noisy sort of situation. And it makes it kind of difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen next. But my feeling is that in all these technologies with where they are, we're at a point where some will sink off, some will stay, some will go up, and other ones will rise. And so I think the general kind of plateau is happening sooner and being more consistent. So I do think there's something different about where we are just now. Time will tell. I'm more interested in the fact that I think these technologies are incredibly promising. And we've got to be careful about not overselling them because that nothing will kill things as stone dead as a person being promised too much and then having the less of it.
Yeah, I think there's so many points of conversation you can go off from that single point. There are so many areas that you can delve into, but I think focusing specifically on healthcare, for example, you mentioned there about not overhyping these kind of technologies. How do you feel that fits into healthcare, but also the fear-mongering as well, people being scared of artificial intelligence replacing their jobs? How do you think that fits into the scenario?
You start with the fact that healthcare demand is exceeding supply. We have more demand than supply. And that gap feels, I think, to many people to be widening. In part, it's kind of real that it's widening because of changes in the population, getting older, more complex diseases as well. So the demand is rising. And the supply is drifting away, again, for a whole bunch of different reasons, because they're having to deliver more complex care to more people. And the people are also used to the world having changed, and so other things happen very quickly. You know, like I can get my Netflix, I can fire it up, I can order food, delivery, whatever it is. My healthcare is not doing that, so that perceived gap grows a great deal. So in that situation, people are very, very keen to understand, well, how can we close that gap? Yeah. Now, I happen to believe that, like, if you look at the world, like over 50% of the world doesn't get ready access to healthcare. If you look globally, right? And that's using the approach that we take right now. And that's very human-based. If anyone knows how we could solve that problem with just training more doctors and nurses, I'd be delighted to hear it. I frankly think it's crazy to think that that would be the case. You just can't do it. What you could conceivably do is borrow doctors and nurses from other parts of the world and concentrate them in one place and fill it up. That's not fair. Yeah. So I think ultimately we're going to have technology and automations to help fill in the gaps and scale the effect of these people as well. And there's lots of different technologies that contribute towards it, but AI seems to be the one that kind of draws them all together in a way that is actually really, I feel really hopeful that it can do it. But at the same time, there's a great pressure to get it solved and fix things. There's not much money in some areas, and we still have to do traditional care as well. You can't just digitize everything. So there's this kind of great storm of ideas and people wanting to rush, and because it's healthcare, they want to make sure it's solved quite quickly. It makes for a difficult time because people are keen to see a solution and people are keen to fix it and get it out there. But you've got to be careful about how you say it because people are so keen to hear it, they might run ahead, and then there could be some risks in there too. So anyone involved in this space does have a responsibility to try and temper their language. It's kind of hard for me because I'm such enthusiast about all of this, but I also realize that if I'm not careful, all these things that I think can happen and will happen might not happen simply because we've put people off or we've misstepped. So yeah, that's kind of where we are, particularly with AI. And there are some voices in AI, particularly people like Sam Altman at OpenAI, who speak very, very boldly about what's going to happen next. And then there are other people in different areas that are more measured about it. Whilst it's nice to hear like a exciting vision of the future, it's not, I don't think, ultimately helpful. And then when you look at healthcare and it's an area you need to be particularly careful, yeah, it's tricky. So I spend my time trying to get out there and tell people about AI and get them using it so they can understand, but hopefully being realistic about what it can and can't do right now. Things that move so fast, might not be able to do it right now, we'll certainly be able to do it tomorrow or the next day.
Yeah. And at the moment, in terms of how AI has been integrated in healthcare, I feel that there's quite a consensus that workflow optimization in terms of administrative tasks is where the value currently lies. Would you agree with that at the moment? And how do you see that sort of changing over the next few years? Not far into the future yet, but over the next few years, do you think workflow optimization is where AI fits into the clinical setting?
Well, there's a few reasons for that, but I mean, at most, remember, healthcare is not just about doctors and nurses. It's like the entire team. You know, you've got the frontline clinical staff, you've got back office staff, you've got non-clinical staff, people doing logistics supplies, putting the roof over the head, holding onto the data, managing and leading them all. So there's this huge team of people. And if you think, well, we're going to use AI, but we're just going to use it at this end, just with the doctors and the nurses. Well, that's just a tiny, tiny part of it. Really, it's very important. It's a small part of it. So why don't we use AI for the rest of it? That's the first thing. Second thing is that the clinical end, even if you were wanting to focus on that, there's a lot of kind of bureaucracy in there and administrative stuff that detracts them from doing the thing that they are absolutely best placed to do. And AI could be used there. So that's the kind of administrative support, things like ambient documentation and scribes, for example. But then if you want to use any technology right at that sharp end, the potential for doing good is high, but the potential for harm is also high as well. And this is where device regulation comes in. And large language models, generative AI, is currently, I keep checking this, but there's not a single medical device regulated that actually has a large language model in it, not a regulated medical device. And there's good reasons for that, because medical device regulation requires certain checks and measures. They're actually quite hard for large language models to meet. At its simplest, regulation is about what is it you say you do, to whom, right, prove it, and that's it. Okay. So I've got a widget that does one thing, does it, I can test it, it's done. Yeah, it might make it through. But instead I've got this large language model that can do like almost anything for almost anyone, but it doesn't kind of do it the same way each time. Like how are you going to prove that? And then these models are built by companies that don't always share exactly how they built them. Makes it very, very hard to get that regulatory status. So I've got this great tool, desperate to use it to help healthcare, can't use it in this little bit here. But there's all this other area here as well. You still have to be careful, you still have to check and make it compliant. But this is the area where you can probably make changes now that will make a difference to the clinical experience and help the entire side. So that could be back office, mid office, supply chain, all of those things. And I think you're right. That's where people are actually, well, that's where the rubber's hitting the road. That's where people are starting to use it now.
Yeah. And what do you think are some of the main barriers at the moment? Obviously, in the NHS, people talk a lot about funding, but so there's a question about how you pay for this kind of technology. But what do you think are the real fundamental barriers to the integration of these kind of technologies into healthcare, and where are they actually needed?
Yeah. There's kind of maybe three areas. I'll probably forget what the three are just now, but I'll go through them. I'll say them out loud first of all. First of all is education and training.
Yes.
The second is the kind of poor state of basic technology and infrastructure within the NHS, and the data, I'll wrap into that. And then the final one is that people are too busy to change anything. Like they're so flat out, they're kind of snookered, like they're so close to the problem, they're just dealing with things right in front of them, they can't. So let's go through those things. So the first one is education. So talked about me being a gamer, just technology, I just love it, I just do it anyway, but I'm not entirely typical. And so I know a lot about technology, and many other people do, and digital and how it can be used, but many of the workforce don't. And that's either undergraduate, like medical students, and other like undergraduate clinicians, then in their junior years, and then the sort of more senior workforce may actually have not much understanding of these technologies. And you do need to understand some of the basics to be able to use them properly. So they don't have that. So how do we fix that? I find it a bit worrying that at medical school, even now, like medical students entering medical school right now, don't have any compulsory core digital health training at all right now. So the doctors who are going to be ready in 4 or 5 years' time are not going to be taught about it. And that's where we are right now. Okay, so there are some small exceptions, but it's not part of the core curriculum. It's often like a kind of module. So you got them. And then they come into work and then they don't get the time to do it. And then you've got the entire workforce who's maybe historically not used it. So if we want to use these technologies well and really think about the opportunities, we need to start fixing that. I think that's the first part. The second part is about the basic infrastructure and the data. So everyone has this idea the NHS has got a ton of data and it's a fantastic resource, but it's...
Dirty data?
Yeah, it's not well located, it's not connected, and it's not even doing the basic job of like informing when I care for a patient, the next patient's care. It's not even doing that well right now. Now there is progress there, but you've got that fact. And then you've got the fact that the actual boxes on the desktop are rubbish, and they take ages to boot up and the software's old and people get locked out and they've got 20 different systems and so just the basic technology. If I talk about AI and people are like, well, that's great, but it takes me 20 minutes to log in the morning. So like, can you not fix that first? So I understand that, but that's a powerful thing against it. And that data's not terribly accessible. So there's some basics that we have to hit. And there's the fact they're just flat out. And like these technologies, this knowledge and everything could really help that. But how do you dig out of that? So that's why I think the back office thing is quite good, because if you can then start offloading some of this and make that time a little bit easier, and resist the urge to just pour more patience into it as well. But with that space, allow people to engage and learn. I think that could be helpful. Using technology that doesn't necessarily require the most bleeding edge technology on your desktop would also help as well. So to that end, helping people just use the phones in their pocket and their own devices would be really helpful too. And then what you can maybe do is you can start offloading that pressure, people start feeling better, and then the kind of returns accelerate. So it's not going to happen all at once. And I don't think people are going to get thanked for it because it'll happen reasonably slowly. So they'll just say it's just changing, I don't notice. But we'll be moving in the right direction. And I think that's the right way to do it. But I do think that we do need to make a serious decision about how we educate people from an undergraduate level, because we've just got another generation of new healthcare professionals that are not being taught what is going to be the absolute bedrock of medicine going forward.
What do you think are some common misconceptions about AI in healthcare, and what can we do to circumvent them?
Okay, so common misconceptions. Number one, it's not like a digital wizard in a box, okay, right? Like, they are very, very capable tools, but that's all that they are. It's easy to talk about AI, particularly very capable generative AI models like large language models, as if you can kind of give them anything and they will do anything. And actually on the surface, you can sort of test it and go, oh, that's great. So you can buy into it. But I prefer to think about a large language model as like this enormous Harry Potter-esque kind of bag that's just like an endless bag of tools. Not just that, it's like there are also tools in there that you can create as well. So it's just this endless toolkit. And your job is to be able to instruct it in such a way that you get the right tool for the job. And because people sort of think of it as being able to do everything, they stop thinking about what you're asking it to do. And so you'll say, I just want you to do X. And actually, in saying that, what you're doing is you're taking something that's quite complex with multiple stages and everything like that, and you're just sort of throwing it without any kind of context. So I often say to people that, AI is a little bit like this sort of super genius intern. And a lot of people deal with it, but, the intern walks in the room, and the first thing you say is, can you do that report? And like, nothing else. You just say nothing else. Just do that report. They'll be like, what report? Like, when do you need it by? Like, all these sort of things. Now, a model, because of how they've been trained, will, working with that, just say, well, like, what's the likely thing that they're going to need with this, and so on. And then you'll get this kind of approximation of the task, and that might do the trick because they're quite good at that. But often it's like, it's not quite right, but because people have been sort of bought into this idea that it's this really capable thing, can't read your mind or anything like that, they sort of bounce a bit off the top and they just go, oh, it's all right, I'm not going to use it again. But if you spend some time with people and explain about how, with these particular models, it's all about how you instruct them, how you break down the task, different ways in which you do it. And it's not complicated to do this. You immediately get a little bit deeper into things. You say, all right, well, I've got more control over this. I can think more about it. What can I use it for? And at that point, people start to understand a bit more about what they can do, what they can't do, what tools are in the box. And then they think, all right, well, I can use it on this task and not that task. That kind of playful experimentation, or safe playful experimentation, I think is really important. So when I talk to people about AI and do my courses on about AI and prompting, which is how you instruct them, it's more about getting people more confident that they can do it. And then I send them away and say, don't use this in medicine just now. Like, go home and use it on, I don't know, recipes or whatever it is. Because the same lessons you learn about that will count in healthcare as you get more confident and the technology gets better. So that's the biggest misconception, is that. The other common misconception is that people think they're kind of learning all the time. Like, I'll go into it, I type something and it'll remember it, and it's training the model and anything. Now, there are some settings where if you interact with an AI model, the manufacturer will have an agreement where they kind of keep the data and use that to train. But most of them kind of have opt-outs now. But even if they did keep it, it's not like actively learning all the time. That data comes in and then they sort of do a big run and they crunch it and then another model comes out. So the models by themselves don't have memory. Like, when you have a conversation, if you go away and come back, it won't remember what's happened before. There are extra tools that can be used to help it with that. But that's the second one. And then the third one is they're trained on a lot, but they're not trained on everything. And so when a person uses a large language model, the answers will come from within that training set. And the amount of data is like head scrambling, like how much is used. But it still has a start and a finish. Often in time, they're trained up to a certain date. So if you ask questions after a certain date, unless it's been equipped with tools to search the web, it's not going to know the answer. But it's been trained to give you an answer, wants to help you, and that's when things like hallucinations become a problem too. So that's the kind of next part of this, is that people kind of expect it to do too much and then don't think enough about how these tools can be used. And then there's a sort of anthropomorphization, the idea that this is in some way actually thinking or anything. It's not. It's a model just predicts the next part of a word and again and again and again until it says it should stop. That's all it's doing. But it does so in a way that's incredibly useful, right? No doubt. You have to kind of resist that urge there too.
So talking on the topic of this curve of AI development, increasing power and new capabilities all the time, where do you think the position of innovation or the balance of innovation and regulation sits? What's your thoughts on, are we being too stringent, or do we need to go further with the regulation?
So the balance between, well, the first thing to say is I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy that regulation stops innovation. I think that stops a lot of intelligent conversation about what we should do about regulation and innovation. I think you can innovate in the regulated space or innovate with regulation, but we park that for a moment. Regulation is very, very important, because if anything does something good or impactful, like if I build some technology, let's say it's an AI technology and I can use it in healthcare and it has the potential to do good, right? The kind of greater potential it has to do good kind of also means it's got quite a great potential to do harm as well, right? And surely, ethically, if that is the case, we need to minimize the risk of harm and maximize the risk of benefit. And that's where kind of regulation comes in, because it's kind of minimizing this risk of harm and telling you to prove this sort of thing. So if you're doing it in an area where the risk of harm is low, then I think regulation can be lighter weight. Where the risk of harm is greater, you're going to need a bunch of proof. That's perfectly fine. The bit where I think it starts to fall down is that AI, because it works in this probabilistic way, it's very, very difficult. Like, you can't kind of do exactly the same thing every single time. And that's difficult because people expect machines to do exactly that. Our regulation's built everything we know about regulation is like, I press this button, it will do that. And it does that every time, and that's great, and it's safe. AI doesn't quite do that, right? Does it quite a lot of the time, but not all the time. Does that mean we can never use it? That's the kind of thing. It has to be perfect or not at all right? So that's maybe one interpretation. But then you look at the real world, right? Okay, and so whenever they do studies with AI and they say, well, AI compared against a doctor and, doctor scored 89% on triage and the model did 87%. Look, humans are still better. But then you say, yeah, but that's like one or two doctors who are being specifically given enough time and enough coffee to sit there and do this and being measured. I worked in clinical governance for a long time, measuring the quality of care. I know what the standard of care is. It is not that. It's often much further down that way for many more people. So we're already accepting that the standard is way, way lower than this. Now, humans are different. We've got like liability and everything like that. But I think something does have to give between the sort of expectation of perfection, machine-like perfection, and like, where do we sit on that bit? That's where the discussion, I think, needs to happen.
That's really interesting.
With humans, we make them liable and we train them and we assess them. We give them lots of exams and everything like that. We watch them in practice, and then we gather enough evidence to say, right, you've demonstrated enough right now that you're good enough to do this particular area. And maybe something like that in these spaces would be helpful, particularly if you can balance it against what the alternative is. And the best example of that is when you look at the rest of the world, in areas where healthcare is very, very scanty, are absorbing technologies very fast. And part of that is because of the demand and need, but part of it is because the baseline of care that maybe they're experiencing in some areas is so problematic that they're happy to tolerate that difference. So this is going to be a really interesting area to watch, but there's no definitive answer yet.
So, finally, with the capabilities of AI improving, how do you see the role of doctors changing moving forward?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, and it's one that different doctors, different healthcare professionals, worry about their own way. But if I just bring it back to doctors, I think doctors have something kind of unique to worry about here, and that's because doctors have traditionally been the people that have the knowledge. If you think back before we had internet and anything like that, you'd have to practice medicine. You'd have to consider a lot of things. So we had to find people that could be taught and store a lot of it and bring it back when they needed it. That was kind of the requirement. And that was only a certain type of people, and it required a certain amount of training, and it allowed them to practice in a certain way. That's all great. But over the last couple of decades, the importance of that has started to diminish. I mean, first with the internet and access to information through search engines and so on, it's easy for anyone to get any information. That's just as well, there's a lot of it, but bring it in. Now, you still have to be able to understand it and apply it and everything like that. So that aspect of being a doctor starts to diminish a little bit. It was balanced out by the fact that doctors ended to get more specialist and they had to kind of know more. But now with AI, it's not just that, but it's also that it can be kind of remixed and reshuffled and represented and put to different things. And different perspectives kind of considered and woven in as well, which was traditionally what doctors did as well. And even if you're a specialist in one area, you know a lot about one area, you don't really know so much about the rest. If you're a generalist, you know a lot about a lot of areas, but maybe not the same level of specialism as everything else. But with AI, you've conceivably got something that can kind of do both. It can be great at all of those things. So you're already saying that the thing that makes you important as a doctor about understanding knowledge, well, that's kind of being automated away. And then being able to consider it all from different perspectives, well, that's kind of being automated away. So understandably, doctors are going, well, what the hell's left? Right, what is that? And will I go? At that point, I would say, yes, there's absolutely so much that is valuable about being a doctor in this particular case. It's just that we have increasingly forgotten what that is, because we have become people slinging knowledge and specialism and like transacting and stuff. The value of being a doctor, to me at least, is being a human, hearing a story from someone who needs to be speaking to someone to hear this, to care for what they're saying, to understand not just the facts, but also the context and the reality of this as well. Bring in all that information and then really help them understand it, because some of this stuff is extremely complicated, and even if you get the facts, sometimes the best choice for one person is completely different to those facts as well. And that is also what doctors do as well. It's not just exclusive doctors, but that's what they do, as well as all the other practical things as well. And so I think AI acting as a mirror is forcing lots of professionals, but doctors in particular, to look at themselves. Well, what does it now mean? And that can be scary if that's the only thing that you think is valuable. But I think it's also one of the most exciting things about being a doctor right now, because we now have a chance, if we participate in this, to work out what happens next. What does it mean to be a doctor when I have this incredible tool and me? That's really exciting. That will look different to what we do right now. We may have to develop new skills. We may have to let go of some things as well, and that will be scary for people. If your entire life and your livelihood is based on this one thing, of course, it can be terrifying to do so. But if we can engage with it, if we can train the next generation, if we can work together to work out what it is, then what happens next could be amazing. That's the position that I come from. But other people don't. So I like to have the conversations. I like people to say, Keith, you're talking nonsense. It's because of this. It helps me understand, because the truth is none of us really know. Yeah. But we do have a point that we get to think about these things right now. And that maybe mean the doctors of the future aren't the ones that can just cram a bunch of stuff in their head. They maybe more intuitive, more emotionally intelligent, still skilled in communication, drawn from different areas. This is the exciting stuff.
Yeah, it really is, and in a way, they might be able to enjoy their jobs more than they do, being able to focus on what they care about.
What burnt me out was the fact that I was no longer able to do what I wanted to do. It becomes a sort of joke in medicine that why do you want to be medicine? Or to help people, and so they're even almost told not to say that at interview and anything like that. And I understand why that is. But that's why they do it. Underneath, that's why I do it.
Yeah.
That's why I'm still a doctor. I don't see patients physically anymore, but I practice medicine, not through the patients that I see, but through the products that I build. I'm still being a doctor. And why am I being a doctor? Because I care. I want to care for people. I want them to feel, I want everyone to have it. That's why I work in tech. That's the driving force. that's when I feel satisfied. I'm a very happy person now because of how that works. And it makes me upset to see so many other doctors and people burnt out and unhappy because they don't have any space to care anymore because they're just chop, 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 slicing things up. So yeah, there's hope to get back to that as well. That'll be great.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.